Hello, Pastor Ethan here from Leroy Covenant Church. I hope this finds you in God's grace, mercy, and peace. Well, this is the first of a two-part series that I want to go through, looking at the book of Daniel. Now, for some of you who may be watching this, you maybe have heard several sermons so far this summer that have come to our church as we've been going through this book. But for others of you, you have not heard the whole preaching series yet, and or you haven't spent much time in Daniel or haven't been able to interact here at church with the material. And so I wanted to give you this as an opportunity to sum things up a little bit more and to be able to sit down in one sitting and get a good chunk of the book under your belt and to kind of understand more about it so you can use it as a devotional and grow in your knowledge of the Bible, but more importantly, to grow in your walk with God and in your faith in Jesus Christ. So this book that we're looking at in the Old Testament is a very unique book for a number of reasons. Number one is that it is broken up mainly into two sections, at least as far as genres are concerned. The first one is chapters 1 through 6, and the second one is 7 through 12. So the first 6 chapters of the book are seen more as historical narrative, written mostly in the third person about a guy named Daniel and his 3 friends that we are introduced to in chapter 1, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, which later become known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they are exiles. They are taken exile into the province of Babylon and into their kingdom, but they are originally Jewish people, Jewish teenagers that were taken probably when they were fairly young, maybe 15 years old, captive by the Babylonian army back to the empire, to where their capital is, and they began service to the king there. But the second 6 chapters of this book are what we consider visionary literature, and a subcategory of visionary literature is apocalyptic literature, a very highly symbolic type of literature that's primary purpose was to bring encouragement and comfort to people who are in or were in distress and going through very difficult times. And in this particular situation, that God is speaking through all of these chapters, whether it's more of a present reality for Daniel and his friends, or whether it's a prediction of what may is to come, that no matter what happens on this earth, good or bad, no matter what president or king is in charge, no matter whether times look really difficult or good, no matter what, God is sovereign. God is in control. There is never a doubt about that in the heavenlies, and even if we can't see it here on earth. And that God has the power to set up kings, God has the power to depose of them, and that God ultimately is the one who's in charge and gets the glory. So that's one thing that makes Daniel unique. Another part that makes Daniel unique is, you've probably heard if you've been to church this summer, is the language. So a lot of our Old Testament we get from the Hebrew Scriptures. Whether it was originally at the very first written, certain parts of it written in what we know as modern day Hebrew is another story. That's another conversation. But most of the latter stuff, that the original manuscripts that we have, were written in Hebrew and translated into that, and then from that it brings us into English. But Daniel's a little unique because we get some of the earliest manuscripts of Daniel are in Hebrew from chapters 1 until the beginning of 2, and then it switches into Aramaic. And it's Aramaic until the end of chapter 7, and then it goes back to Hebrew in chapters 8 through 12. So because of this, some of the Hebrew that we see in chapters 2 through 7 is not your normal Hebrew that you see in other books. But inside this structure, chapters 2 through 7, what we see is it has kind of its own independent structure, and some scholars call this a chiastic structure, where chapter 2 and chapter 7 kind of parallel each other in some themes, chapters 3 and 6 kind of parallel each other, and then 4 and 5 kind of parallel each other, and they're kind of the meat of what's in the middle here. And we'll go through a little bit of why that is, and what we understand here, but that's kind of how it's structured. But I will say that chapter 7 is unique. because the way it is written fits, kind of the language of it fits a lot of what comes before, but it's also speaking of more prophecies, which fits with the second part of the book, but it's still in Aramaic, so it's kind of a hinge chapter. It's a very important chapter for the author, Daniel, and whoever finally put the book together, to transition us from the first part of the book to the second part of the book. Okay? So, all that being said, let's learn a little bit more about what is going on here. So, if you look in your English Bibles, Daniel, as the book, is often lumped with the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. But if you look in your Hebrew scripture, it is usually found among the historical, prophetic, poetic books: Ruth, Chronicles, Ezra, Esther, Lamentations, and then Daniel. So, kind of interesting that it's part prophetic, but it's also part historical, and that's true of what we find. And even Daniel as himself, as a person, Daniel is a prophet, but he's not really a prophet like the other Old Testament prophets are. The other Old Testament prophets are commissioned by God, but nowhere in this book do we see that Daniel is commissioned by, especially when we don't see that phrase, familiar phrase, "Thus says the Lord." But he still works in a prophetic way. So that in itself is unique as well. But Daniel and his friends come across to us and are introduced to us in this book as wise people, as wise sages that are living life and obeying God, and especially while they're in foreign captivity. And so we see this among a couple other biblical characters. We see it in Joseph and Esther and Nehemiah, a very serving foreign kings and being wise in the relationship with them and with their God while they're somewhere else. So also, whereas the unjustly accused are usually proved innocent, with Daniel there is always like a constant danger. It seems to succeed with one king and then maybe kind of goes back down and then works his way up, then goes back down. It's kind of a flow, but the focus is ultimately not on Daniel. It's not on his friends. It's not even on the kings. It's about what God is doing. It's about God at the end of the book. Okay? So that's kind of Daniel as the book. That's kind of Daniel as the person. But then also we need to connect to that the author. Now, the traditional view is that Daniel, the actual historical person, wrote this book. That is the traditional long-held belief, that he wrote it during the 6th century after these events took place. But the more modern view is that an anonymous Jew or Jewish people wrote them way into the 2nd century BCE, during a very difficult, crazy time of a Hellenistic Seleucid king. If I get his name here, I'm looking at my notes. Antiochus Epiphanes was kind of a nasty ruler to the Jewish people, heavily persecuted the Jewish people, desecrated the temple by offering pigs, was a very just evil man. And so some people think it was written about that time because it seems like Daniel chapter 11 alludes to him and to his rule and some other things as well. So, and because of some other factors, some people think it was not written in ultimately until the 2nd century BCE. But there are good arguments. There are arguments for both sides, but there's not enough argument to say that an earlier date of the 6th century could not have been possible. So Daniel, to have written it at that time, there are good arguments for that. But who finally put the book together as a whole and everything, that maybe remains an unknown. Okay, the audience, though, was probably the Jewish, if it was written in the 6th century, the Jewish people who were still in exile in Babylon and that were looking for hope and encouragement. But you see how that speaks to other generations and even speaks to us today. People are going through trials and persecutions, or maybe refugees, people like that are questioning, is God still on his throne? Is he still in charge? Can I trust him? What is going on? Is the world going to hell in a handbasket? They can look at this material and be encouraged and be comforted that, nope, God is still working behind the scenes. God's still on the throne. And you know what? God is actually with his people in a special way that are in exile. In Ezekiel, get this idea that the presence of God left the temple. And where was he going? He was going to the exiles. That's pretty crazy. but we know God is still everywhere. Okay, and then this last piece that we want to look at before we actually dive into the book a little bit is we want to look at the historical situation, because this is really important. So if you go back to about 900 to 1000 BCE, the 10th century, mid 10th century, the United Kingdom of Israel was split. Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Well, that didn't last super long. By about 722, the northern kingdom, I should say not about, but at 722, the northern kingdom of Assyria, which started ruling about 25 years prior, what is today northern Iraq, northeast Syria, they came and basically completely destroyed the north, right? And then by 701, they came back again, and there was these threats to Jerusalem, and eventually it takes place, and the northern kingdom goes into captivity, and the southern kingdom barely escapes. Right? We talked about that. 701 comes back, and that's during the time of Hezekiah surrounds the city, but they are ultimately delivered by God. And so the southern kingdom gets a pass for 100 plus years, but their time is coming too. Why? Because of their grievous sins and rebellion and idolatry against God, the one who saved them, the one who formed them, the one who called them. They are committing adultery in a symbolic way with God. They are prostituting themselves to all these other gods and all these other ways of thinking. Even though God made covenant with them, they are breaking it. So God is bringing judgment upon them. So Assyria started to lose power after one of the rulers, Ashurbanipal, died in about 627 BCE. And within 20 to 25 years, Assyrian power is completely gone, as well as Egyptian power, because Egypt was defeated. Their big army was defeated at the Battle of Carchemish in 605. And then by 605 as well, the Babylonian kingdom was on the rise, and the first main ruler, Nebuchadnezzar II, invaded Palestine, and he took some of the first exiles captive back to Babylon, and that would include Daniel and his 3 friends. And then about 8 years after this, in 597, the king of Judah, Jehoiakim, at the time, rebelled against Babylon, and he died. So his son came to the throne and surrendered to Nebuchadnezzar, and that's when more exiles were taken after that. And then another king was placed, Zedekiah, kind of a king you could say, not really, but placed by Nebuchadnezzar onto the throne. But he rebelled again, and by 587, Babylon had enough, and Jerusalem was basically completely destroyed, the southern kingdom, and almost everybody taken into exile. So after that, eventually Nebuchadnezzar dies, his empire starts to decline, the Medo-Persian kingdom is on the rise, Cyrus the Persian takes control, defeats Babylon for sure, and then he's the one who allows the exiles return to Jerusalem. And then finally, the Persian kingdom rules for a while until the time of Alexander the Great. So that's kind of the historical situation of where we find things. So we get in chapter 1 of Daniel that we are introduced to Daniel and his 3 friends who are living in and around Jerusalem in 605, right when Nebuchadnezzar is starting to invade Palestine. Now, these were teenagers, these were Yahweh followers who who worshiped the God of Israel, right? And they were being taken captive as political propaganda pieces, I guess you could say, as political prisoners, back to Babylon to be enculturated, to use one word by a scholar, Dr. Wendy Witter, for 3 years, so that they would learn all the ways of Babylon. And then if they did well, they would enter service to the king, either as advisors or magicians or astrologers or some other way to serve them. And then the king could be like, hey, look what we did to our prisoners. Look, and now they're serving us, and things like that. But remember that they are still Jewish people serving their God, hopefully, and they are now going to be in the royal court of a pagan Gentile kingdom and king. So pretty amazing. And in the first chapter, we get introduced to him, and we find out that they are very wise, that God gives Daniel and his 3 friends wisdom. But Daniel gets a special kind of dose that he can interpret dreams. Well, it comes to a time when they're sitting there that the king wants to give, or the person set above Daniel and his friends, who's underneath the king, is giving them food from the king's table. Now, this ultimately is not about actual food. This is about what that food represents. If they eat that food, they are basically saying they are in covenant with this Gentile pagan king, and that's a step too far for them. They cannot make that. They cannot accommodate that. So they say, nope, I'm not going to defile themselves. And what we end up getting is God blessing them because of it. And they shine and they get promoted in the kingdom, and they're serving the king. And it says Daniel at the very last part of chapter 1 remains there until the first year of Cyrus. That's about 70 years after this is written. So Daniel spent probably his entire life after being a teenager in exile in Babylon. Now, chapter 2, we get it. It changes into, very early on, it changes into like we said, Aramaic. But here we get introduced to this king Nebuchadnezzar even more so, and he has a dream, and he calls all the people in his land, the smart ones, the advisors, the astrologers, to try to get them to tell him what the dream was. This was unheard of. No king would ever ask something like that, because that kind of knowledge, I mean, that's ultimately the gods, and to not understand what a dream meant was a big deal. So here the king either wants to kind of depose and find a reason to depose of these advisors because he's mad at them for some reason, or maybe he just wants to severely test them. I don't know, but he says, you tell me my dream. And he really wants to know it because he doesn't understand what it means. He remembers his dream, and the dream came from Yahweh. Remember that. And therefore only Yahweh could bring the interpretation of it, and he really wants to know. Well, enter Daniel. He's able to interpret it from the king. But basically the interpretation of the king, or of the dream, is that the king is the head of this large statue. He represents the kingdom of Babylon. And underneath him, as the statue of a Persian goes, the value of the metals goes down while the hardness goes up to the statue that's being described. Daniel ultimately says, you, Nebuchadnezzar, you're the head of gold. God gave you this kingdom, but hey, just realize that you and every other kingdom are ultimately going to be defeated, and going to be nothing compared to God's eternal kingdom. So he gives that message to the king, and Daniel praises God that God reveals himself to them and to the king. So God's doing the work behind the scenes to the king. And then ultimately Nebuchadnezzar bows down and says, surely your God is the God of gods and Lord of lords, a revealer of mysteries, for you are able to reveal this mystery. And Daniel is placed in a high position, and same with his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So chapter 2 will somewhat relate to chapter 7 in these images that are being described in these dreams and these visions. But then we get into chapter 3 and we get reintroduced. This is the first time that we actually get an idea of who Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are. We even get, they talk a little bit. It's the only time they ever do that. But this kind of parallels chapter 6 with Daniel in the lion's den, in that both of them are faced with tough circumstances. They both choose not to disobey God, but to honor him. They face the consequences, but both times God miraculously delivers them. So maybe because King Nebuchadnezzar had that dream about the statue, and he was told he was the head of gold, for whatever reason, now he decides to actually build an image of gold. Now, if you do the measurements on this thing was 90 feet high, but almost a tenth of that wide. So it's a very thin, high pole, overlaid with gold most likely. But he wants everybody to bow down to it. Well, for whatever reason, I don't know where Daniel is at this time, and I don't know who's keeping an eye out, but the three Jewish exiles that are close to him, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they will not bow down. And so therefore they get thrown into this fiery furnace. It's some sort of big pit furnace. They get thrown in, and nothing happens to them. They don't get burned. They don't die. They live. They survive. But Nebuchadnezzar, for the third chapter now he's introduced here, and we interact with him. He gets up and says, there's someone else in that fire. There's a fourth person, like a son of the gods, like a holy one. Who is that? Well, he finally goes over. They bring them out. Nothing is wrong with them, and he is amazed. And same with everybody else around them. So they came out of the fire. Nothing is scorched. And Nebuchadnezzar has to say, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel to rescue him." They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve and or worship any god except their own. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation and culture that say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be cut to pieces, and so on and so forth. So Nebuchadnezzar is getting a glimpse of who this real God, this God of Israel, Yahweh, is, little by little, and showing more and more that he's ultimately in control. And we get a little bit more of a confession of an understanding, I guess, of faith of who he is as the chapters go on. But God is doing a work in the midst and in the life of this pagan Gentile king, which is amazing, and in that culture. So that's the second time that the king has this, and he tells everybody, hey, to fear and honor and reverence the God of Israel, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Well, Darius says the very same thing in chapter 6 to Daniel after he's saved from the lions in the den, that all the people should fear and reverence Daniel's God. So once we get to chapter 4, it's very unique. Nebuchadnezzar gives us a first-hand account of a dream, another dream that he had, another vision that he had. And he even starts by saying, I'm going to tell you about the miraculous signs and the things that the Most High God, aka the God of Israel, Yahweh, did, how great he is. And he says he had this dream that he saw this cosmic tree, that roots would go down into the netherworld. The tree would go up to hold the heavens up, or even into the heavens, and it would show life and just all of this amazing thing. Well, Nebuchadnezzar's that tree is so powerful. His branches are to go out there to bless everybody, and we're going to get back to that, to bless his kingdom, to keep them safe, to treat people fairly. That all is a gift from God. But then the tree's cut down in his vision. And it goes through this very hard time, and he wakes up and he's like, what does this mean? Well, enter Daniel again. He interprets it for the king. Seems to have had a relationship now with the king. He's probably been serving Nebuchadnezzar for decades now. And he says to him, okay, I'll tell you, you're the tree. And you were God gave you the wisdom and the power to rule your people. But you saw, verse 23, a messenger come and say, cut down the tree and let him be drenched with the dew of heaven and live with the animals. And then he says, you will be driven away from people. 7 times will pass by until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms of the earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. And the command to leave the stump there means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. But then Daniel goes on to say, hear what I have to say, king. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. Daniel is actually able to give his 2 cents to the king. So what we have here is the king basically being very arrogant, being very proud, right? That afterwards, even after he has this vision a year later, he thinks how great he is, and this exact stuff that he saw in his vision happens to him. He's demoted. He maybe has some psychotic breakdown, but then he finally acknowledges that God is God and his kingdom is restored. But Daniel tells him too, hey, king, wake up. Don't be sinning. Don't be oppressing people and hurting people. You were placed there for a reason, for a purpose, to bless your kingdom and to acknowledge the God who gave it to you. So that was what he says before that year later and what happens to Nebuchadnezzar. And then he finally wakes up and we get this. He realizes what happens here. So at the end of the time, verse 34, he finally raised his eyes towards heaven. His sanity was restored. And then he praised God, said his kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. No one can tell him what to do. And then verse 36 into 37, I praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right. He is just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. So this great, great, great king realizes that Yahweh, the God of Israel, he's something else, the Most High God, and he can humble anybody he wants. He's on the throne. And so we get this little humility to Nebuchadnezzar, Whether he became a monotheist and only worshiped that God or not, probably not, but we don't know that for sure. But this ends the information and the stuff about Nebuchadnezzar. But we're right in that middle of that sandwich, right? That chiastic structure. So chapter 4 and 5 are kind of at that middle. Well, chapter 5 introduces us to a new king, but a king who's even more arrogant and even more prideful and wants to undo Nebuchadnezzar. But what we find is that his end is much worse than Nebuchadnezzar's was. So in chapter 5, we get introduced to Belshazzar. Now, Belshazzar was not a biological descendant or a great grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. What he was he was the son of a usurper. So his dad basically got into that position by kind of a bad way, and then he took off, and then this guy, his son, just kind of filled the gap while he was gone. So it's kind of a complicated situation with the person that we are being introduced to here. We hardly know anything about this guy named Belshazzar. So it's a complicated thing, but he's serving this king. Daniel is much later in life, probably in his 80s by now. But Belshazzar has this great banquet. He wants to praise and glorify the kings or the gods of all these things that are false: gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, stone, things that don't talk, things that don't breathe. So he wants to praise all of them, right? And what he does is he has the goblets not just the goblets, but the royal pieces that were part of the temple in Jerusalem brought in to drink wine out of those and basically shame the God of Israel, the God who was defeated by his predecessors. And he's really, not only is he ticking off his own gods, whose temples he took them out of because they belong to those gods, he is also offending the God of Israel, and this is not good. So what happens is that the king sees a hand writing something on the wall, and no one can understand it, no one can interpret it, until the queen mother comes in and says, hey, don't forget about Daniel. He has a keen mind, a keen spirit, exceptional qualities, wisdom. Your father, your descendant, he called on him. You probably should too. So it's exactly what he does, and Daniel tells him, okay, I'm going to tell you what this means. I don't need any of your gifts. I don't need any things, but you are way arrogant. You are not doing what you should be doing. You knew what happened to Nebuchadnezzar and your father. You knew how God humbled him, and you knew how he finally acknowledged the God of heaven. But you won't do that. You will not do that. Verse 22, you've not humbled yourself. Instead, you've set yourself up against the Lord of heaven and done whatever you wanted to do. But you did not honor God, who holds in his hand your life and your ways. Therefore, this is what the inscription on the wall means. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin are nouns, but Daniel's going to translate them as verbs. There's some sort of weight or maybe a value of money. And so he translates them as verbs. God has numbered your days and your reign and brought it to an end. And that's mentioned twice. Definitely going to happen. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. You're guilty. You've done it wrong. And then Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians, which the text goes on to say that happens that night. And Darius the Mede takes over. So this is the end of the Babylonian kingdom. And then finally we get that other part of this middle section that this king, this other king, does not, even though he does not honor God, Nebuchadnezzar didn't really either, but maybe a little bit more so, but he definitely does it. And these two kings, two different things happen. One humbles himself and seems to be okay, the other one doesn't, and he is killed. So there again, God can put up whoever he wants, God can take down whatever he wants, but he is looking for acknowledgement from people about this, right? And that God is going to take care of his people, because this death of this Babylonian king is going to rise up the next kingdom who will ultimately lead the exiles back to Jerusalem. So what God is doing behind the scenes is incredible. So finally that gets us into chapter 6, a very popular story that a lot of people know, Daniel in the Lion's Den, but there's a lot going on here that maybe you don't know. So it pleased Darius the Mede to appoint 120 satraps or rulers over the kingdom, and Daniel is an administrator over them. Now Darius the Mede could also be seen as the same person as Cyrus the Persian. It gets a little bit complicated, but as a footnote in the Bible, it says perhaps Darius was a Median ruler who ruled Babylon for a short period of time under the greater authority of Cyrus, or perhaps Darius was the man known as Gubaru, the governor of Babylon, or maybe Darius could be another name for Cyrus. It's kind of complicated, but probably it's seen as maybe the same person, okay? And that was from the NIV Zondervan Study Bible Notes by D.A. Carson. But I think that's a good summary. But this guy puts Daniel way up on top, and he does so well. It tells us that Daniel has such good qualities, such excellent qualities, such a keen mind, that he was not corrupt, but he was a man of integrity. And he did everything right, even in serving a pagan Gentile government. Daniel, nothing could be found against him. He was doing everything right. And the king wanted to set him up as the second highest person in the kingdom. But people didn't like that, right? They didn't like the fact that Daniel was a goody two-shoe, more or less. They didn't like the fact that he was a Boy Scout, right? He did things right. So, because it messed up their corrupt plans. So they get together, they form a conspiracy and basically trump up a charge that is going to push their agenda and their political ideas and some of this stuff across, that it's going to hurt Daniel. So some scholars think that they were kind of an extreme religious group that wanted to have some sort of monotheistic type of religion where they primarily worship one God even though they knew others existed. And that's why they were like, okay, king, you're going to kind of act as our guy right now, either as a priest, or you're going to kind of be this connection to the divine. We'll pray to you, and look, all the other officials agree to this. You just agree to it, and then what it would do is you would create a conflict for Daniel, because they knew that God, or this thing that they were trying to push through, Daniel wouldn't buy, so therefore he would be guilty, and then they would have their revenge. What's interesting, though, is that this government and this king in this period of time was known for religious freedom, that people could worship whatever they want. They would have a plethora of gods, and you worshipped each of them to not make him mad. So why the king would go about this, also being a king who would not be prone to deify himself in any sort of way, is very curious. But probably it has to do with flattery of this group of conspirators against him, but also peer pressure, and he gave into it. He made a dumb law that said, okay, yep, I'll agree to that. Well, Daniel goes home, just lives life normally as he usually does, and that means getting down on his knees, facing towards Jerusalem, not because it's the city he's worshiping, but what it represents and who it represents. God, the God of Israel, the hope of Israel, and then also the hope of where the Savior and God's future reign that would last forever, this eternal king, would come out of. That's what kept him secure. That's what kept him bold. That's what kept him on track. And this is the exact same thing that Solomon told the people to do, was when they, in the dedication of the temple, 1 Kings 8, when you're in a foreign country and you're finding yourself in this place, look towards the temple, look towards Jerusalem, ask for forgiveness and seek it, so that God may bring you compassion, or bring compassion, deliver you, save you. And that's exactly what Daniel's doing. His hope is secure in the God of Israel. Well, Daniel is thrown into the den of lions, but he's miraculously saved, much like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And now you have another king, Darius here, which may also be Cyrus, saying that now I want to issue a decree into all the kingdom, talking about how God is a living God and his kingdom and glory and dominion never end, and they rule forever. This is super ironic that he is doing this, but it just goes to show that God is at work in the lives of his people. He is bringing them hope. He is bringing them encouragement. He's bringing them comfort even in the crazy times, and he's working in and through even pagan Gentile rulers to form his purposes. And ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, God will bring his people back to Jerusalem, and then in the fullness of time, the Savior, Jesus Christ, will be born, will be the ultimate deliverer, the one that will offer redemption and offer a new life and a new faith in him alone. So this ends those that first those first chapters of Daniel chapter 6, which are like the historical narrative portions of it. And then what we'll see in the next video is that hinge chapter of 7, which leads us into these prophecies that Daniel will see about the future for the centuries to come and the chapters to come. But ultimately, it all comes back to God is with his people. God's way rules. His plan will succeed, even if the most evil empire, even if the most evil king rises. We as a people of God stay faithful to God. And we know that ultimately he's in control and he's lining up things even if it doesn't seem like it. We stay faithful to him and we shine our light just like Daniel did, and he will take care of the rest. So I hope this was informative for you. I hope it was interesting. And praise be to God for this word and for his word. So God's blessings upon you. We'll see you in the next video.